Number 1. The case of Dr. Harold Shipman, the British general practitioner whose murderous career spanned nearly 3 decades and claimed at least 215 verified victims, stands as the most prolific serial killer in modern medical history. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, into a working-class family headed by his father, a truck driver, and his mother, Vera, whose death from lung cancer when Harold was 17 would profoundly shape his future methods. Witnessing his mother receive morphine for pain relief in her final days, Shipman later admitted this experience influenced his choice of murder weapon. He studied medicine at Leeds University, graduating in 1970, and began his medical practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, where he first developed a dependency on pethidine, a synthetic opioid, leading to his dismissal from the practice in 1975 after forging prescriptions to feed his addiction. Unlike many medical professionals whose careers would end after such disgrace, Shipman secured a position at the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, Greater Manchester, in 1977, where he would remain until his arrest in 1998, building what appeared to be an exemplary reputation as a caring, attentive family doctor who made house calls when other physicians had abandoned the practice. His patients, predominantly elderly women, adored him. He was known for spending unusual amounts of time with them, for remembering intimate details about their lives, for being present at their deaths when no other doctor would bother. His colleagues respected him, though some found him arrogant, controlling, and oddly possessive of his patients. He married Primrose Oxtoby in 1966, and together they raised 4 children, presenting an image of conventional domestic respectability that masked his secret life. Beneath this facade, however, Shipman was systematically murdering his patients with lethal injections of diamorphine, pharmaceutical-grade heroin, often signing their death certificates himself with fabricated causes ranging from heart failure to old age, carefully selecting victims who lived alone, had few surviving family members, and whose deaths would raise no suspicions in a community that trusted its doctor implicitly. The victims of Harold Shipman were not merely statistics in a criminal case but individuals with full lives, families, and futures that were stolen from them. Kathleen Grundy, whose death at 81 on June 24, 1998, would ultimately expose Shipman's crimes, had been a formidable presence in Hyde. A former mayor of the town and active community volunteer, Grundy was widowed, financially independent, and in remarkably good health for her age, still maintaining her own home and social calendar. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, an attorney, became suspicious when a will surfaced after her mother's death that left £386,000 to Shipman, a document crudely forged with Grundy's signature misspelled. Woodruff's insistence on investigation, against the resistance of local authorities who initially dismissed her concerns, would prove pivotal. Other victims included Elizabeth Meller, 73, found dead in her home on May 28, 1998, having been perfectly healthy that morning when Shipman visited; Lizzie Adams, 77, who died on January 8, 1998, after Shipman made an unexpected house call; and Bianca Pomfret, 49, one of Shipman's younger victims, whose husband had died previously under Shipman's care. Marie Quinn, 67, died on November 7, 1997, after Shipman administered what he claimed was a blood sample. Her death certificate cited bronchopneumonia. Winifred Melland, 73, died on February 2, 1998, her death attributed to old age despite having no significant health problems. These women represented hundreds more, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, friends, each with decades of memories, family photographs, recipes, and stories that ended abruptly in their living rooms, bedrooms, and kitchens, often with Shipman still present, affecting grief, sometimes offering to handle funeral arrangements, occasionally stealing jewelry or making himself beneficiary to their estates. The true scale of victimization extended beyond death to the systematic erasure of these women's narratives, their deaths misrecorded, their families left with false explanations, their bodies cremated before questions could arise. Hyde, Greater Manchester, in the late 20th century was a former mill town in economic transition. Its textile industries largely collapsed, its population aging as younger residents moved to Manchester for employment. The community retained strong working-class traditions of mutual dependence and respect for authority figures, particularly doctors who represented scarce professional expertise in an underserved area. Shipman's practice served approximately 3,000 patients, many elderly, many living alone in the Victorian terraced houses that characterized the neighborhood. The town's demographic profile, a high concentration of elderly women, many widowed, many with limited family contact, provided ideal conditions for predators who could exploit institutional trust. Local funeral directors noticed that Shipman patients died with unusual frequency, often fully dressed, apparently sudden, with the doctor himself present, but their informal concerns to colleagues were dismissed as professional gossip. The police, when occasionally notified of unusual patterns, accepted Shipman's explanations without thorough investigation in 1990, 1992, and 1995, each missed opportunity allowing dozens more deaths. The cultural deference to medical authority, the isolation of elderly residents, the fragmentation of family structures in post-industrial Britain, and the absence of systematic mortality review all contributed to an environment where hundreds could die without detection. Hyde's experience would profoundly influence subsequent British healthcare policy, demonstrating how community trust, when exploited by those who understood its architecture, could become lethal. The timeline of Shipman's criminal career reveals not sudden deviation but gradual escalation and refinement of method. His earliest confirmed murder occurred in 1975, that of 70-year-old Eva Lyons at the Row Cross practice, though the true start date remains unknown. Throughout the 1980s, he killed with increasing frequency, averaging roughly one victim monthly, always selecting those whose deaths would attract minimal attention. The pattern intensified in the 1990s. Between 1990 and 1994, he killed at least 71 patients, in 1996 alone, at least 37. The method remained consistent: intravenous diamorphine, often injected in the patient's home during routine visits, death occurring within minutes, Shipman signing the death certificate with plausible but fabricated causes. He evolved in his exploitation. Early killings rarely involved financial gain, but by the mid-1990s, he was altering wills, stealing valuables, establishing himself as executor. The final phase, 1997 to 1998, showed both increased frequency and decreased caution, as if long immunity had bred contempt for detection. On June 24, 1998, his final confirmed victim, Kathleen Grundy, died in her home on Market Street. That morning, Shipman had visited unexpectedly, claiming concern about her health despite her recent excellent checkup. He administered the fatal injection, returned to his surgery, and that afternoon made himself beneficiary of a will he had clumsily typed on his own typewriter, misspelling Grundy's name. Angela Woodruff, discovering this document, noted her mother's actual will left everything to family. The forgery was obvious, the signature wrong, the circumstances impossible. Her persistence, against the reluctance of authorities who suggested her mother had simply changed her mind, initiated the investigation that would finally expose decades of murder. The crimes themselves, reconstructed through exhaustive forensic investigation, followed a chillingly consistent pattern. Shipman would visit patients, often without appointment, expressing concern about their health or claiming routine blood tests were needed. He carried medical bags containing preloaded syringes of diamorphine, stolen from his practice or obtained through fraudulent prescriptions. The injection, typically in the arm or hand, caused death within minutes from respiratory depression. Shipman would then position the body, often fully clothed, sometimes with glasses or reading material nearby, creating the impression of sudden natural death. He would certify death himself, citing heart failure, stroke, or age-related decline, and encourage families toward cremation, destroying physical evidence. In dozens of cases, he returned to patients' homes to grieve, sometimes before family arrived, occasionally taking jewelry, cash, or documents. The scale of his thefts remained modest. He was not materially greedy so much as desirous of control, of playing God with life and death, of the intimate power of being present at the moment of expiration. Psychological analysis after conviction suggested complex motivations: the addiction to power, the obsessive compulsion of repeating a successful method, the narcissistic satisfaction of outwitting an entire community, perhaps even a twisted reenactment of his mother's death with himself as both killer and comforter. Discovery and investigation of Shipman's crimes unfolded through layers of institutional failure and eventual determined intervention. Angela Woodruff's complaint to police on August 7, 1998, initially met with skepticism. The suggestion that a respected doctor had murdered her mother and forged her will seemed fantastic. Detective Superintendent Bernard Possells, assigned to investigate, approached the case with appropriate caution but increasing alarm as preliminary inquiries revealed that Shipman had signed Kathleen Grundy's death certificate despite having apparently no recent medical reason to visit, and that Grundy's medical records showed her in excellent health. Exhumation of Grundy's body on September 1, 1998, revealed lethal concentrations of diamorphine, enough to kill several people. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police identified 15 additional deaths of Shipman patients with suspicious circumstances, exhumed 3 more bodies, and found diamorphine in all. On September 7, 1998, officers arrested Shipman at his home in Row Cross Road, Hyde, seizing medical records, his typewriter, and jewelry belonging to deceased patients. His initial response was calm denial. Presented with evidence, he claimed his patients had been in pain, that he had provided appropriate palliative care. The scale of suspicion required unprecedented measures. A team of detectives began reviewing every death certificate Shipman had signed, ultimately identifying 459 cases for detailed examination. The investigation consumed 16 months, involved hundreds of officers, and cost approximately £21 million, becoming the most extensive murder inquiry in British history. Forensic investigation proved decisive in establishing both individual murders and systematic method. Pathologist Dr. John Rutherford conducted post-mortem examinations on 23 exhumed bodies, finding evidence of diamorphine administration in all cases where tissue remained sufficiently preserved. Toxicological analysis by Dr. Robert Forrest developed innovative techniques for detecting morphine metabolites in decomposed remains, establishing that victims had received injections shortly before death rather than therapeutic doses over extended periods. Analysis of Shipman's prescription records revealed systematic acquisition of diamorphine. Between 1976 and 1998, he had prescribed massive quantities, far exceeding any legitimate medical need, often for patients who had never received opioids previously. Computer analysis of death patterns by University of Leicester statistician Professor David Spiegelhalter demonstrated that Shipman's patient mortality rate was extraordinary. Between 1987 and 1998, his practice recorded 345 deaths compared to an expected 106 based on demographic comparisons, with death rates highest during Monday afternoon surgery hours when Shipman worked alone. Forensic document examination confirmed that the forged Kathleen Grundy will had been created on Shipman's brother's typewriter, which Shipman had borrowed. Digital analysis of his practice computers, initially deleted but recovered by experts, revealed that Shipman had altered patient records postmortem to fabricate medical histories consistent with his false death certifications. Each forensic discipline contributed to an evidentiary structure that was individually damning and collectively overwhelming. The investigative breakthrough crystallized through Angela Woodruff's persistence and Detective Possel's methodical expansion. Initial suspicion focused narrowly on Grundy, but the pattern of diamorphine prescriptions quickly suggested systematic offending. The decision to exhume multiple bodies, culturally distasteful and legally complex, proved essential. Without physical proof of poisoning, charges might not have proceeded. Shipman's arrest on September 7, 1998, was carefully planned. Officers arrived at 6 a.m., catching him unprepared, seizing materials before destruction was possible. His refusal to answer questions during 30 hours of interrogation, while legally prudent, appeared damning in context. The investigation's most critical phase involved the unprecedented decision to review all Shipman patient deaths, a massive data analysis project that identified hundreds of probable murders beyond those immediately chargeable. This expansion, while essential for understanding the true scope of crimes, created legal complications. Many families would never see individual charges, their loved ones' deaths subsumed into the total without specific judicial acknowledgement. The final charges, filed in October 1999, covered 15 murders and 1 forgery, a pragmatic selection of cases with strongest forensic evidence, though investigators and subsequent inquiries confirmed hundreds more. Shipman's continued denials, his maintenance of innocence even when conviction was certain, his refusal to assist in identifying all victims, demonstrated the same psychological architecture that had enabled his crimes: absolute certainty in his own superiority, contempt for those who would judge him, inability to acknowledge any wrongdoing even when caught. Legal proceedings against Harold Shipman commenced at Preston Crown Court on October 5, 1999, before Mr. Justice Forbes, with Richard Henriquez QC leading the prosecution and the defendant represented by Nicola Davies QC. The prosecution's case extended over 5 months, presenting evidence on each of 15 murders with meticulous chronological and forensic detail. Henriquez established the pattern: elderly women, living alone, found dead shortly after Shipman's unscheduled visits, with diamorphine in their bodies and forged medical records suggesting fabricated illnesses. The defense, constrained by Shipman's insistence on innocence and refusal to consider diminished responsibility pleas, argued that deaths were natural, that morphine presence resulted from therapeutic administration for genuine symptoms, that Shipman was a caring doctor unfortunate in his patient's fragility. This strategy collapsed against the statistical evidence, the forged will, the altered records, the massive unexplained morphine acquisitions. Key prosecution witnesses included pathologists who explained postmortem findings, toxicologists who detailed detection methods, statisticians who demonstrated mortality impossibilities, and family members who described Shipman's behavior at deaths. Particularly affecting was the testimony of Kathleen Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, whose determined pursuit of justice had initiated the entire prosecution. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Shipman himself testified, presenting himself as compassionate physician betrayed by statistical misunderstanding, his calm demeanor cracking only when confronted with the forged will. The jury, after 53 days of evidence and 6 days of deliberation, returned guilty verdicts on all 15 murder counts and the forgery charge on January 31, 2000. Mr. Justice Forbes imposed 15 consecutive life sentences with a recommendation that Shipman never be released, the most severe sentence available under English law. Sentencing and its aftermath revealed both the limitations of criminal justice and the profound societal impact of Shipman's crimes. The life without parole recommendation, while symbolically significant, was politically controversial. The Home Secretary's subsequent decision to confirm whole-life tariff reflected public horror more than legal necessity. Shipman's imprisonment at Franklin Prison, County Durham, saw him maintain his innocence, refuse participation in rehabilitation programs, and show no remorse. His suicide on January 13, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday. By hanging himself in his cell using bedsheets, denied families the possibility of eventual truth-telling, he took full knowledge of his victims to his grave. The immediate aftermath prompted 2 major public inquiries. The first, chaired by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith, examined the clinical and regulatory failures that had allowed Shipman's career, identifying systemic deficiencies in death certification, controlled drug monitoring, and physician oversight. The second, led by Liam Donaldson, Chief Medical Officer, proposed comprehensive reforms to medical regulation. The Smith Inquiry's final report in 2005 confirmed 218 definite victims, estimated total deaths between 250 and 459, and made numerous recommendations implemented in subsequent legislation. Civil litigation by families, complicated by Shipman's death and limited estate, resulted in partial compensation through government funds. The most profound impacts were cultural and institutional: the destruction of traditional deference toward medical authority, the transformation of British general practice through revalidation requirements and enhanced monitoring, the establishment of systems for mortality pattern analysis that might detect similar offenders. For Hyde, the trauma proved enduring. A community that had prided itself on neighborliness confronted its own blindness, the hundreds of families who had thanked Shipman for his care at their relatives' deaths, the impossibility of knowing which deaths were natural and which were murder. Memorials to victims were established, but the town's identity remains permanently marked by association with evil that wore the most trusted of masks. Number 2. The case of Diane Downs, the Oregon mother who shot her 3 children in 1983 and fabricated a carjacking story to conceal her crime, represents one of the most disturbing examples of filicide in American criminal history. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, to Wes and Willadine Fredrickson, who raised their daughter in a strict Mormon household that emphasized conventional femininity, domestic service, and suppressed emotional expression. Diane's childhood, by her own later accounts and those of family members, was marked by paternal abuse and maternal acquiescence, though these claims remain contested. She married Steve Downs in 1973 after becoming pregnant with his child, a union that ended in 1980 when Steve discovered Diane's infidelity and left her. The marriage produced 3 children: Christy Ann, born in 1974, Cheryl Lynn, born 1976, and Stephen Daniel, born 1979. Following the divorce, Diane's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She engaged in numerous affairs, became obsessed with a married man, Robert Knickerbocker, who made clear he would not leave his wife for a woman with 3 children, and developed elaborate fantasies of escaping her maternal responsibilities. Her employment as a postal worker in Springfield, Oregon, provided financial stability but not the romantic fulfillment she sought. Witnesses later testified that she spoke casually of giving her children away, of accidents that might befall them, of her desperate desire to be free for a new relationship. Her appearance was striking: blonde, attractive, physically fit, and she cultivated an image of energetic, devoted motherhood that concealed profound psychological disturbance. Those who knew her casually saw a struggling single mother doing her best. Those who observed her more closely noted disturbing inconsistencies. The children often appeared unkempt, Diane's attention to them was performative rather than genuine, and her emotional responses seemed calculated for effect rather than authentic. The victims of Diane Downs' calculated violence were her own children, each possessing distinct personalities and developmental stages that made their victimization particularly poignant. Christian Downs, 8 years old in 1983, was the eldest and most articulate, a bright, responsible child who had assumed quasi-parental responsibilities for her younger siblings given her mother's emotional absence. Christy survived 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, one of which partially collapsed her lung and caused severe blood loss. Her survival and eventual testimony would prove crucial to prosecution. Cheryl Lynn Downs, 7 years old, was shot at close range in the back of the head and died instantly at the scene. She was described by teachers as gentle, artistic, and particularly close to her brother Danny. Stephen Daniel Downs, 3 years old, suffered a severed spinal cord from a gunshot wound that left him permanently paralyzed from the chest down. He would spend his life in a wheelchair requiring constant care, eventually dying in 2017 from complications related to his injuries. These children were not merely obstacles to their mother's romantic aspirations but individuals with friendships, school achievements, and developing identities. Cheryl had recently learned to read, Danny was learning to ride a tricycle, Christy had begun keeping a diary. Their father's absence, their mother's instability, and their own efforts to maintain family coherence despite adult failures made their final night of consciousness riding in a car with a mother who had already decided to kill them almost unbearably tragic. The long-term survivors' subsequent lives, Christy's testimony and Danny's medical struggles, extended the consequences of Downs' crime across decades. Springfield, Oregon, in the early 1980s was a working-class suburban community outside Eugene, characterized by lumber industry employment, conservative social values, and limited economic opportunity. The Downs family lived in a small rental home on their modest circumstances typical of the neighborhood's postal workers, service employees, and unemployed timber workers. The community's response to the initial reports of carjacking and child shooting reflected genuine shock and sympathetic support. Neighbors organized blood drives, local businesses donated funds, strangers sent toys and cards to the hospitalized children. This generosity, manipulated by Downs for personal attention and financial gain, would make subsequent revelations of her guilt particularly betraying. The Lane County Sheriff's Office, initially investigating stranger violence, found a community eager to assist, to believe that such horror could only come from outside, from the transient criminal elements that pass through I-5 corridor towns. The physical environment of the crime. Old Mohawk Road, a rural lane where Downs claimed a bushy-haired stranger had forced her from her car, shot her children, and driven away, was familiar territory, a place where locals walked dogs and teenagers parked, not a landscape of random violence. The dissonance between this familiar, safe community and the violent deaths of 2 children created the emotional conditions for both initial credulity and subsequent rage when deception was exposed. Oregon's social services, already strained by recession-era budget cuts, had limited involvement with the Downs family despite reported concerns from school personnel about the children's welfare. This systemic failure, like the community's misplaced trust, would be re-examined in the case's aftermath. The timeline of events leading to the shooting reveals calculated preparation rather than spontaneous violence. By spring 1983, Robert Knickerbocker had definitively rejected Diane's increasingly desperate advances, telling her directly that 3 children were incompatible with his life plans. Downs' response was not to seek counseling or support but to develop murderous resolution. She purchased a .22 caliber Ruger pistol in February, practiced at local firing ranges, and began telling acquaintances that she might have to get rid of the children. On the evening of May 19, 1983, she collected Christy, Cheryl, and Danny from the babysitter, drove to a remote location on Old Mohawk Road, and shot each child at close range. Cheryl died instantly, Danny and Christy were left for dead. Downs then shot herself in the arm, a superficial wound consistent with self-infliction rather than defensive injury, and drove to Mackenzie Willamette Hospital, arriving at approximately 10:30 p.m. with a fabricated story of carjacking by a stranger she described in contradictory detail. Her behavior at the hospital was immediately noted as unusual. Despite claiming to have been attacked, she showed no fear, provided inconsistent descriptions of the supposed assailant, and seemed disproportionately concerned with her own minor injury rather than her children's critical conditions. Hospital staff, while providing emergency care, began internal documentation of these anomalies, One nurse would later testify that Downs's demeanor suggested acting rather than genuine trauma. The children's survival, against Downs's apparent expectations, created the evidentiary foundation for eventual prosecution, as Christie would eventually recover sufficient function to describe what had actually occurred. The crime itself, as reconstructed through forensic evidence and surviving victim testimony, demonstrated deliberate execution rather than panicked violence. Downs had selected a location with limited visibility, ensuring no witnesses. She had chosen a weapon and ammunition suitable for close-range killing. She had arranged the children in the car to facilitate rapid shooting. Cheryl, shot first and at closest range, received the fatal wound to the back of her head, suggesting she may have been turned away or unaware. Danny and Christie, shot subsequently, showed evidence of movement attempts, suggesting consciousness and terror. Downs's self-inflicted arm wound, positioned on the exterior surface rather than consistent with defensive posture, and lacking powder burns or other indicators of close-range shooting by another, was medically inconsistent with her account. The absence of any other physical evidence at the scene, no other vehicle tracks, no signs of struggle, no foreign fingerprints or DNA, contradicted claims of violent encounter with a stranger. Downs's own physical condition, coherent speech, and detailed narrative immediately after supposed traumatic attack further undermined her credibility. The children's injuries, particularly Christie's, showed evidence of subsequent movement and positioning inconsistent with Downs's account of their positions in the car. Every forensic detail, examined with increasing scrutiny as investigation developed, pointed toward a single shooter, Diane Downs herself, motivated by desire to eliminate obstacles to a relationship that existed only in her imagination. Discovery and initial investigation proceeded through layers of official response and growing suspicion. Lane County Sheriff's Office deputies responding to the hospital report initially treated the case as stranger violence, organizing roadblocks and searches for the described assailant while collecting Downs's statement. Her description of bushy-haired stranger with acne scars, driving a stolen vehicle, was sufficiently detailed to generate extensive but fruitless investigation. Within hours, however, inconsistencies emerged. Downs's description changed between tellings. The supposed carjacking location showed no evidence of violence. Her own injury appeared self-inflicted to experienced medical personnel. Detectives Fred Hughey and Kurt Wiest, assigned to lead investigation, shifted from sympathetic victim interview to skeptical interrogation within 48 hours. Critical developments included Christie's survival and gradual recovery. Though initially unable to speak due to stroke effects from blood loss, she began communicating through yes-no signals and eventually limited speech. Her account, emerging over weeks of careful therapeutic interviewing, directly contradicted her mother's. There had been no stranger, only her mother shooting, then driving to the hospital with the children bleeding in the back seat. Danny, younger and more severely injured, could not provide similar testimony, but his medical records confirmed injury patterns consistent with Christie's description. The investigation expanded to include Downs's relationship history, revealing her obsession with Robert Knickerbocker and his explicit rejection, her firearms purchase and practice, her statements to acquaintances about getting rid of the children. By June 1983, prosecutors had sufficient evidence to present to grand jury, though Christie's testimony remained limited and her full recovery uncertain. Forensic investigation provided essential corroboration for survivor testimony and systematic refutation of Downs's claims. Ballistics analysis confirmed that all four shootings, Cheryl, Danny, Christie, and Downs herself, were committed with the same .22 caliber weapon, Downs's recently purchased Ruger. Trajectory analysis demonstrated that the children's wounds were consistent with seated positions and close-range firing from the driver's side rear, not from an external assailant at the driver's window as Downs claimed. Gunshot residue testing on Downs's clothing and hands, though limited by technology of the period, showed patterns consistent with firing a weapon rather than merely receiving a wound. Blood spatter analysis of the car's interior demonstrated shooting positions and subsequent movements inconsistent with Downs's narrative. Examination of Downs's wound by pathologist Dr. George S. Ruth determined it was self-inflicted, superficial, and deliberately non-incapacitating. Toxicology found no evidence that Downs had been drugged or incapacitated as she sometimes suggested. Perhaps most significantly, forensic analysis of Downs's clothing and the car's interior revealed blood patterns showing she had moved actively between shooting positions rather than being forced from the vehicle. The absence of any foreign DNA, fingerprints, or physical evidence, despite Downs's claims of violent struggle, completed the evidentiary structure demonstrating her sole responsibility. Each forensic discipline reinforced others. creating comprehensive proof that could withstand defense attempts to create reasonable doubt through alternative scenario speculation. The investigative breakthrough crystallized through Christie's gradual recovery in testimony. Medical professionals had initially doubted she would survive. When she did, stroke effects initially prevented speech and caused right-sided paralysis. Speech therapist Joanne Shirley worked with Christie over months, developing communication methods that eventually allowed detailed account. In August 1983, Christie told detectives that her mother had stopped the car, turned around, and shot the children one by one, that she had seen her mother shoot herself, that there had been no stranger. This testimony, recorded carefully to avoid suggestibility concerns, provided direct evidence of guilt that complemented circumstantial and forensic proof. Downs's arrest on February 28, 1984, followed extensive preparation by prosecutors who wanted Christie available to testify despite defense challenges to child witness competence. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Downs, maintaining innocence, submitted without resistance, apparently convinced that her performance would ultimately convince a jury. The search of her home revealed diaries documenting her obsession with Robert Knickerbocker, her resentment of maternal responsibilities, and her determination to escape her circumstances. These documents, though partially coded, provided devastating insight into motivation. The investigation's most challenging aspect was preparing Christie for testimony. At 9 years old, having suffered severe trauma, she would face cross-examination attempting to impeach her credibility through childhood inconsistency and suggestibility. Prosecutors invested months in careful preparation, ensuring Christie understood the process and could withstand pressure. Legal proceedings against Diane Downs commenced in Lane County Circuit Court on May 8, 1984, before Judge Gregory Foote, with District Attorney Pat Horton leading prosecution and renowned defense attorney J. Marvin Kuhn representing Downs. The prosecution's strategy centered on Christie's testimony supported by comprehensive forensic evidence. The child would tell the jury what she had seen, and experts would confirm that physical evidence matched her account and contradicted defendants' claims. The defense, recognizing the power of child testimony, attempted to establish alternative theories. The bushy-haired stranger existed despite failed search. Downs was mentally ill and therefore not responsible. Police had manipulated Christie through suggestive interviewing. Kuhn's cross-examination of Christie, though aggressive, failed to shake her core account. Her simple, direct description of her mother's shooting carried devastating credibility. The prosecution's forensic presentation, led by state crime laboratory experts, systematically demolished Downs's carjacking narrative through ballistics, blood spatter, wound analysis, and physical evidence review. Perhaps the trial's most dramatic moment came when Downs herself testified, presenting herself as loving mother victimized by violent crime and prosecutorial persecution. Her performance, described by observers as theatrical and unconvincing, allowed jury direct comparison between her account and evidence. Closing arguments emphasized the convergence of survivor testimony and forensic proof. Christie had no motive to lie, possessed no capacity to fabricate consistent forensic detail, and had demonstrated remarkable courage. The jury, after 4 days of deliberation, returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of assault on June 17, 1984. Judge Foote imposed consecutive sentences totaling life plus 50 years, ensuring Downs would never be released. Sentencing and post-conviction proceedings extended across decades with multiple dramatic developments. Downs's immediate appeal, arguing improper admission of certain evidence and prosecutorial misconduct, was denied by Oregon Court of Appeals in 1986. She then pursued federal habeas corpus relief, again unsuccessfully, exhausting direct appeal by 1990. In 1987, Downs escaped from Oregon Women's Correctional Center by climbing through fence during recreation period. Captured 10 days later, she was convicted of escape and additional time added. Her disciplinary record in prison included multiple infractions involving sexual relationships with male inmates through correspondence, manipulation of other prisoners, and continued attempts to manipulate media attention. Most significantly, Downs gave birth to a 4th child in 1984, conceived before incarceration and surrendered for adoption. This child, eventually identified through DNA testing, heard her biological mother's story with understandable horror. Christie's adoption by Lane County prosecutor Fred Hughey and his wife, completed in 1986, provided her stable environment for recovery. She eventually became a child welfare professional, using her experience to assist other abused children. Danny remained in medical care until his 2017 death, his life a testament to both survival and permanent disability. Downs's parole hearings, beginning in 2008 and continuing periodically, have consistently resulted in denials. The Oregon Parole Board has cited her continued denial of guilt, failure to demonstrate remorse, and prison disciplinary record as all supporting continued incarceration. She remains incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility as of 2024, having been transferred out of Oregon pursuant to interstate corrections agreements. The lasting impact of the Diane Downs case extends through criminal justice, child protection, and popular culture. Oregon's child witness procedures were substantially revised based on Christie's experience, establishing protocols for interviewing young trauma survivors that balance evidentiary needs with psychological protection. The case demonstrated that children, properly supported, could provide reliable testimony against parental defendants, influencing prosecution strategies nationwide. Media coverage, particularly in Rule's 1987 book Small Sacrifices and subsequent television adaptation, established the case as cultural touchstone for discussions of maternal filicide, narcissistic personality disorder, and the performance of female violence. Women's studies scholars have examined the case for its illustration of how maternal identity constraints can produce pathological responses. Criminologists have studied Downs as exemplifying instrumental filicide, killing for practical benefit rather than altruistic or acutely psychotic motivations. For Springfield, the case represented traumatic disruption of community identity, the revelation that horror could emerge not from external threat but from within domestic respectability. The Hughey family's adoption of Christie, controversial at the time due to prosecutor involvement with witness, was ultimately vindicated by her successful adaptation and professional contribution. Cheryl and Danny Downs are memorialized in Oregon crime victim commemorations. Christie's survival represents both individual resilience and systemic capacity, however imperfect, to protect children and punish their abusers. The case's continuing relevance, demonstrated by ongoing documentary production and public interest, reflects persistent cultural fascination with maternal violence and the questions Downs's crimes raise about love, performance, and the darkness possible within apparent normalcy. Number 3. The case of John Franklin Bandy, the Arizona teenager whose 1996 murder of his neighbor Shannon Aumock became a flashpoint for debates about juvenile justice and statutory limitations, reveals the catastrophic consequences of adolescent obsession and violence. John Franklin Bandy, born in 1979 in Phoenix, Arizona, was the son of working-class parents whose marriage ended in divorce during his early childhood, leaving him primarily in his mother's custody with limited paternal involvement. By adolescence, Bandy presented a troubling psychological portrait: socially isolated, academically underperforming, obsessed with military history and weapons, and developing what would later be diagnosed as severe conduct disorder with emerging antisocial features. His appearance was unremarkable: slight build, unthreatening demeanor, glasses, and he cultivated online personas that exaggerated his physical and social capabilities while his actual relationships were virtually non-existent. His mother, concerned by his increasing belligerence and fascination with violence, had sought counseling services, but interventions were limited by insurance constraints and Bandy's own refusal to engage meaningfully with therapeutic process. His school records documented disciplinary incidents involving threats toward female students, though none had resulted in serious consequences. Teachers described him as intelligent but disengaged, occasionally disturbing in his written works violent themes, yet not obviously dangerous to those who lacked access to his private writings and online activities. The community in which he lived, a middle-class Phoenix suburb, perceived him as unfortunate but not alarming, another adolescent struggling with family disruption and social maladjustment rather than a developing predator whose fantasies were approaching operational reality. Shannon Aumock, born in 1980, was Bandy's 14-year-old neighbor and classmate, a vibrant teenager with established friendships, academic interests, and developing identity. She was described by family and teachers as outgoing, artistic, particularly talented in music, with plans for high school and beyond that reflected normal adolescent aspiration. Her family, established in the community with professional employment and stable home life, had no reason to perceive the Bandy household as threatening despite geographic proximity. Shannon's daily routines included walking to school, spending time with friends, and developing the independence appropriate to early adolescence. She possessed, according to those who knew her, the normal wariness of strangers but the assumption of safety in familiar environments that characterized her generation and community. Her physical appearance, attractive in conventional teenage terms, attracted attention she was learning to manage, including unwanted interest from Bandy that she had explicitly rejected in incidents witnesses later described. The dynamic between them, as reconstructed through investigation, showed Bandy's obsessive interest meeting Shannon's clear disinterest and occasional mockery, a pattern that fueled his resentment and confirmed his misogynistic beliefs about female cruelty and male entitlement. Shannon was not merely a random target but a specific object of Bandy's ideation, selected for availability, rejection history, and symbolic value as representative of the feminine popularity and social success he lacked. Her death, when it came, terminated not merely individual life but entire trajectory of development, the adult Shannon would never become, the contribution she would never make, the grief of family that would never fully resolve. Paradise Valley, Arizona, in the mid-1990s was an affluent Phoenix suburb characterized by resort amenities, luxury real estate, and exceptional public services that insulated residents from the urban problems visible in neighboring communities. The Bandy and Aumock residences were located in a pleasant residential neighborhood where children walked to good schools, parents maintained professional employment, and crime rates were low enough that stranger violence seemed genuinely implausible. This context of apparent safety contributed to both Shannon's vulnerability and subsequent community trauma. The assumption that such neighborhoods were protected from serious crime meant that adolescent warning signs were minimized, that parental supervision was relaxed, that the possibility of neighbor as predator was psychologically unavailable. The Phoenix metropolitan area's rapid growth during this period created transient populations and strained social services even in affluent communities. The Bandy family's history, their divorce, their utilization of counseling services, did not trigger systematic intervention because no system existed to coordinate fragmented information across schools, healthcare, and social services. The physical environment of the crime, the desert washes and undeveloped land that characterized Paradise Valley's landscape, provided both opportunity for abduction and subsequent concealment, the same geography that attracted residents with its natural beauty enabling violent resolution of Bandy's obsessive fantasy. The community's response to Shannon's disappearance and subsequent death revealed both solidarity and division, grief and support for the Aumock family, defensive denial among those who had known Bandy, retrospective examination of missed opportunities for intervention that inevitably found systemic deficiencies without clear assignment of individual blame. The timeline of events leading to Shannon Aumock's murder demonstrates progressive escalation of Bandy's fantasies toward operational violence. By early 1996, Bandy had developed elaborate plans for sexual violence against female targets, documented in journals and computer files that would be recovered after his arrest. These materials included detailed scenarios involving abduction, restraint, and murder, with specific attention to Shannon Aumock as preferred victim. His acquisition of weapons and restraint materials, conducted through legitimate purchase and mail order, proceeded without detection by family or authorities. On May 28, 1996, Bandy encountered Shannon walking in their neighborhood. What began as conversation or approach escalated to confrontation, then violence. The precise sequence at the initial encounter remains partially unclear, but Bandy successfully transported Shannon to a remote desert location where he implemented his planned assault. The murder, when resistance or interruption threatened his control, was committed with a weapon he had specifically prepared for this purpose. Bandy's subsequent actions demonstrated preparation for extended concealment. He buried Shannon's body in shallow desert grave, cleaned and disposed of evidence, and returned to normal activities with apparent composure. His mother's later recollection of his behavior that evening, unusually calm, dismissive of questions, fit pattern of dissociative response observed in some adolescent offenders, though prosecution would emphasize calculated deception over genuine psychological disruption. Bandy's maintenance of innocence over subsequent days, his participation in community search efforts for Shannon, his expressions of concern to neighbors, represented either remarkable composure or genuine absence of remorse depending on interpretive framework applied. The crime itself, as established through forensic recovery and Bandy's eventual statements, involved abduction, sexual assault, and murder in desert isolation. Bandy had selected location for remoteness, prepared materials including restraints and digging tools, and implemented plan that allowed several hours of private control over victim. The cause of death, determined through skeletal analysis when body was eventually recovered, was blunt force trauma and possible asphyxiation. The sexual assault was confirmed through DNA evidence preserved despite environmental exposure. Bandy's method demonstrated both fantasy enactment and practical adaptation. Elements of his written scenarios were implemented while others were modified by circumstances, suggesting operational flexibility rather than rigid compulsion. The burial, shallow and poorly concealed, indicated either limited time, limited planning for post-crime phase, or expecting the desert environment would prevent discovery. Shannon's personal effects were removed and disposed separately, some recovered later, providing additional evidentiary links. The duration of Bandy's control, estimated at several hours based on witness timelines of his absence from home, allowed both implementation of assault and subsequent cleanup and return. His psychological state during this period, reconstructed through later examination, combined obsessive focus with apparent emotional detachment, the fantasy fulfillment proceeding without evident empathy for victims' terror and suffering. The murder, when committed, appears to have been instrumental, eliminating witness rather than integral to sexual gratification, a pattern consistent with instrumental rather than expressive offending. Discovery and initial investigation followed the trajectory of parental alarm, community mobilization, and gradual focusing of suspicion. Shannon's failure to return home on May 28 prompted immediate family concern and notification of Paradise Valley Police. Her non-appearance was completely inconsistent with established behavior patterns. Initial search efforts, involving family, friends, and law enforcement, expanded across coming days to include organized search and rescue operations surveying desert terrain where she might have become lost or injured. The absence of any indication of voluntary disappearance, no conflict with family, no depression, no preparations, directed investigation toward abduction scenarios. Bandy's name emerged early through witness reports of his interest in Shannon and their neighborhood encounter shortly before her disappearance. His initial interview, conducted within 72 hours, produced denial, an apparent alibi that required subsequent verification. The investigation's critical turn came with analysis of Bandy's computer and written materials, seized pursuant to warrant based on emerging probable cause, the detailed violent fantasies, specific references to Shannon, acquisition records for weapons and restraint materials, created compelling circumstantial case even before physical evidence was developed. The FBI's involvement, requested given potential interstate elements in Bandy's online activities and mail order purchases, provided additional forensic and investigative resources. The search for Shannon's body extended over weeks of organized effort in desert terrain. Her eventual recovery, through information developed in investigation rather than Bandy's cooperation, provided essential confirmation of death and forensic evidence for prosecution. Forensic investigation in the Bandy case exemplified emerging capabilities of mid-1990s crime scene analysis and DNA technology. Recovery of Shannon's skeletal remains, though complicated by environmental exposure and animal activity, allowed determination of cause of death through fracture patterns and contextual evidence. DNA analysis of recovered materials, comparing Bandy's genetic profile against evidence from crime scene, provided statistical certainty of his presence and activity. This technology, still novel enough to require explanatory testimony for jury education, was pivotal in linking Bandy to physical crime scene. Analysis of Bandy's computer files, conducted by FBI computer forensics specialists, recovered deleted materials documenting his planning and fantasies. The metaphor of digital trails, increasingly significant in criminal investigation, was literally applicable as his browsing history, downloaded materials, and created documents were reconstructed. Physical evidence from Bandy's residence, including fibers matching those at recovery site, tools consistent with burial implements, and trace materials linking him to Shannon, accumulated through systematic search warrant execution. The forensic timeline construction, integrating digital evidence of his online activities, witness observations, and physical evidence sequencing, established comprehensive narrative of preparation, execution, and attempted concealment. Perhaps most significantly for case development, forensic analysis demonstrated that Bandy's planning had extended over months, that his acquisition of materials was systematic, and that his selection of Shannon was specific rather than opportunistic, all elements supporting prosecution theory of premeditated murder rather than impulsive adolescent violence. The investigative breakthrough came with integration of digital forensics and physical evidence development. Bandy's computer, initially examined for communications, yielded far more significant material in his own created documents, violent sexual fantasies with specific details matching aspects of Shannon's assault, journal entries tracking his developing obsession with her, lists of needed materials with acquisition status. This evidence, impossible to explain as innocent or misinterpreted, shifted investigation from suspicion to certainty and supported arrest warrant issuance. Bandy was arrested on June 17, 1996, at his mother's residence without resistance. Search of his room and person produced additional physical evidence. His interrogation, conducted by experienced juvenile investigators with attention to Miranda requirements given his age, produced initial denial followed by partial admission when confronted with documentary evidence. The admission was limited, admission of presence and engagement but not of murder, suggesting Bandy's recognition of physical evidence strength while attempting to minimize legal culpability. His legal representation, appointed given family financial constraints, immediately intervened to terminate questioning. Subsequent communication proceeded through counsel. The investigation's completion involved extensive correlation of Bandy's statements, documentary evidence, physical proof, and forensic analysis to construct comprehensive case for prosecution. The decision to charge as adult, made by Maricopa County Attorney's Office, reflected offense severity, evidence of planning and premeditation, and Bandy's age at 17 being within discretionary transfer range. This decision would be challenged but ultimately upheld through appellate review. Legal proceedings against John Franklin Bandy were extraordinarily complex, extending over years through jurisdictional challenges, constitutional litigation, and eventual resolution. Initially charged as adult in Maricopa County Superior Court with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, Bandy's defense challenged transfer from juvenile jurisdiction through appeal to Arizona Supreme Court, which upheld adult prosecution in 1997. The trial, eventually commencing in 1999 before Judge Ronald Reinstein, presented prosecution case built on forensic evidence, Bandy's partial admissions, and comprehensive documentary proof of planning. Defense emphasized adolescent impulsivity, family dysfunction, and Bandy's psychological disturbance as mitigating culpability. The jury, after deliberation, convicted on all counts and imposed death sentence, finding aggravating circumstances including crime heinousness and victim vulnerability. This sentence initiated extraordinary appellate history. Automatic appeal to Arizona Supreme Court affirmed conviction but vacated death sentence due to procedural error in penalty phase. Resentencing produced second death sentence. Subsequent federal habeas corpus proceedings examining constitutional claims including juvenile death penalty prohibition developing under evolving Eighth Amendment jurisprudence. The United States Supreme Court's 2005 decision in Roper v. Simmons, abolishing death penalty for offenders under 18 at crime commission, directly affected Bandy. His death sentence was vacated and converted to natural life imprisonment. Additional litigation addressed sentencing credit for time in custody, conditions of confinement, and eventual placement within Arizona Department of Corrections system. Sentencing and post-conviction developments reflected broader transformations in juvenile justice policy. Bandy's natural life sentence, imposed after Roper v. Simmons remand, provided no possibility of release. He would die in prison for crimes committed at 17. His incarceration, initially in Arizona juvenile facilities then adult prison upon reaching majority, has been characterized by disciplinary infractions and mental health interventions. His psychological disturbance, evident at offense commission, has persisted or intensified in confinement. Periodic reclassification reviews have maintained maximum security status. The appellate litigation, extensive as it was, established significant precedent. Arizona's juvenile transfer procedures were substantially revised to provide greater procedural protection, and Bandy's case was cited in subsequent national discussions of adolescent brain development and criminal culpability. For the Aumock family, the legal proceedings provided no resolution, only extended exposure to their daughter's killer through multiple court appearances. Their victim impact statements, delivered at various sentencing proceedings, documented permanent grief and opposition to any sentence reduction. Community impact in Paradise Valley included persistent examination of how Bandy's warning signs had been missed, with subsequent enhancement of school threat assessment protocols and adolescent mental health service availability. These changes, too late for Shannon, may have prevented subsequent similar tragedies. The case's national significance emerged through its role in Roper v. Simmons litigation and subsequent policy discussions. Bandy became one of the adolescent offenders whose sentences were re-examined under evolving constitutional standards, his individual case illustrating broader questions about adolescent culpability, capacity for change, and appropriate state response to youthful violence. Number 4. The case of Anthony Shore, the Houston serial killer who strangled 5 young women between 1986 and 1995, exemplifies how technological advancement in forensic science can resurrect dormant investigations and achieve justice decades after crime commission. Anthony Allen Shore was born on June 25, 1962, in Rapid City, South Dakota, into a military family that relocated repeatedly during his childhood, preventing stable peer relationships and consistent educational experience. His father, a career Army officer, was reportedly emotionally distant and physically abusive, his mother developed substance dependence issues that compromised her parenting. Shore's own account, provided after arrest, described early sexual experimentation and violence toward animals that escalated through adolescence. These claims, while potentially self-serving, were consistent with documented behavioral patterns in violent offenders. The family settled in Houston, Texas, in 1970s, where Shore attended high school with limited academic success and significant disciplinary issues involving inappropriate sexual behavior toward female students. His adult employment history was unstable. Brief military service ended in discharge for substance abuse, followed by marginal employment as telephone repair technician, maintenance worker, and musician in local bands. His marriages, two by the time of his crimes, were characterized by domestic violence, infidelity, and eventual dissolution. His second wife would later testify to his sexual violence and deviant interests. Shore's appearance, medium build, unremarkable features, professional demeanor when employed allowed him to blend into Houston's working-class neighborhoods where he selected victims. His criminal record prior to the murders included burglary and auto theft, offenses that resulted in limited incarceration without triggering sustained intervention. The escalation to sexual homicide, when it occurred, proceeded without detection for nearly a decade. The victims of Anthony Shore were young women and girls selected for vulnerability and accessibility, each possessing distinct lives prematurely terminated. Lori Tremblay, 14, was Shore's first confirmed victim, abducted in September 1986 while walking to school. Her body, discovered days later, showed evidence of sexual assault and strangulation, with her own belt used as ligature. She was a freshman at Spring Woods High School, described by teachers as quiet but promising, with family relationships complicated by parental divorce but fundamentally stable. Maria del Carmen Estrada, 21, was attacked in April 1992 while walking to work in the Gulfton area. Her strangulation with a nylon cord that Shore retained as trophy demonstrated evolution in his method. Estrada was an immigrant from Mexico working to support family both in Houston and abroad, her death devastating transnational family networks. Selma Jansk, 9, represented Shore's youngest victim, abducted in October 1993 while playing near her apartment complex. Her murder, particularly, generated sustained community outrage and intensive but unsuccessful investigation. Diana Ribolar, 15, was killed in August 1994, her body discovered near a Harris County road. She had been walking to convenience store when Shore encountered her. Dana Sanchez, 16, was the final confirmed victim, murdered in July 1995 after Shore offered her ride. Her sister had reported her missing, generating immediate search that located body but not killer. These 5 represent confirmed victims. Shore implied additional killings without providing sufficient detail for verification. Each victim was more than case number. Tremblay's mother maintained bedroom unchanged for years. Estrada's family conducted annual memorial masses. Jansk's elementary school established scholarship. Ribolar's friends organized annual remembrance. Sanchez's sister became victim advocate. Shore's selection of young, physically slight, often isolated victims demonstrated predatory calculation. His retention of implements and jewelry as trophies reflected paraphilic attachment to killing. His decade-long evasion of detection despite substantial forensic evidence illustrated limitations of 1980s to 1990s investigation. Houston, Texas, in the 1980s and 1990s was a rapidly expanding metropolis with severe social stratification, concentrated wealth and suburban enclaves surrounding urban cores of poverty, immigrant settlement, and limited public services. The Gulfton area, where several victims lived, was particularly characterized by high-density apartment housing, transient populations, limited English proficiency among many residents, and overstretched law enforcement response, conditions that enabled predator mobility and complicated investigation. The Houston Police Department and Harris County Sheriff's Office, despite substantial resources, faced violent crime volumes that prevented sustained focus on individual cases without immediate solvability indicators. The absence of connections between Shore's victims, their distribution across jurisdictions, and initial absence of forensic database technology created conditions for extended series without pattern recognition. The physical environment of Houston, extensive highway networks enabling rapid transport, numerous undeveloped areas for body disposal, subtropical climate accelerating evidence degradation, provided practical advantages to offenders with local knowledge. Shore's employment as telephone repair technician gave him legitimate access to residential areas, familiarity with neighborhood layouts, and occupational cover for presence in various locations. This employment, terminated for theft in 1997, had facilitated victim access without raising suspicion. The community response to individual murders combined genuine grief with practical resignation. Young women of color in marginalized neighborhoods disappeared with disturbing frequency, their deaths receiving limited media attention compared to comparable crimes in affluent areas, their families struggling to obtain sustained investigative commitment. This differential response, documented by victim advocates and scholars, represented systemic injustice that Shore exploited and that subsequent reform efforts attempted to address. The timeline of Shore's criminal career shows progressive refinement of method and extended evasion. His first murder, Laurie Tremblay in 1986, occurred when Shore was 24, following years of escalating sexual violence and fantasy development. The killing, while accomplished, showed elements of improvisation suggesting limited prior operational experience. The 6-year gap before Maria del Carmen Estrada's murder in 1992 may reflect continued offending without detection, incarceration for non-capital offenses, or genuine period of non-killing. Shore's accounts have been inconsistent. The 1992 to 1995 period saw accelerated frequency, Estrada, Jansk, Rebollar, and Sanchez in 3 years, suggesting increasing compulsion or confidence and evasion capability. The method evolved, ligature strangulation with victim belts or cords used consistently, sexual assault prior to death, body positioning and location selection demonstrating planning, trophy retention including ligatures and jewelry. Shore's cessation after 1995 coincided with employment termination, second marriage dissolution, and increased substance abuse, factors that may have affected offending capacity or victim access. Alternatively, undetected killings may have continued. The specific events of each murder followed pattern. Shore encountered victim in public location, offered or forced transportation to isolated setting, implemented sexual assault and strangulation, retained trophies, and disposed body in remote location. His return to some sites, documented through surveillance, suggested ongoing fantasy connection to offenses. The near misses, attempted abductions interrupted, witnesses observing suspicious behavior, did not result in identification or intervention, illustrating how serial offenders can experience multiple opportunities for detection without consequence until forensic or investigative breakthrough occurs. The crimes themselves, reconstructed through Shore's eventual confession and forensic evidence, demonstrated organized predatory offending with paraphilic motivated torture elements. Shore would approach victims with ruse or force, transport them to locations where prolonged control was possible, and implement sexual assault with escalating violence. Strangulation, his preferred killing method, was often applied repeatedly, choking to unconsciousness, resuscitation, repetition, extending victim suffering and offender gratification. The ligatures, victims' own belts or cords Shore carried, were retained and later used for autoerotic activity, demonstrating clear paraphilic function. Post-mortem mutilation in some cases suggested additional violent fantasy enactment. Shore's documentation of offenses, through written records and audio tapes discovered after arrest, provided unprecedented detail of offender psychology, his perception of victims as objects, his enjoyment of their fear and suffering, his pride in evasion, his ongoing fantasy life connecting to offenses years later. The forensic evidence developed contemporaneously: DNA from sexual assault retained in case files, ligature impressions, fiber evidence awaited technological capability that would eventually enable identification. Shore's ability to continue normal occupational and social functioning, to form relationships and father children, while maintaining this secret violence, illustrated the compartmentalization capacity that enables extended serial offending. His victims' families meanwhile experienced permanent rupture, anniversaries of loss without resolution, the daily absence of promised futures. Discovery and initial investigation of Shore's crimes proceeded case by case without pattern recognition or offender identification. Laurie Tremblay's 1986 murder generated intensive immediate investigation. Springwoods High School students were interviewed, sex offenders in area registered, forensic evidence collected and preserved with emerging DNA technology, though database capability was non-existent. The absence of eyewitnesses, the limited suspect pool, and the absence of similar subsequent crimes in immediate period allowed case to become cold despite family and community pressure. Maria del Carmen Estrada's 1992 killing was investigated by Houston police without connection to Tremblay. Different jurisdiction, different victim demographic, different specific method obscured potential linkage. Selma Jansk's 1993 murder generated exceptional community response given victim age, with substantial rewards offered and extensive media coverage, but again without forensic database technology to identify offender through DNA. Diana Rebelar's and Dana Sanchez's murders in 1994 to 1995 received similar individualized investigation without systematic linkage analysis. The critical limitation was technological. DNA evidence was collected and preserved, but no database existed to compare profiles across cases or against known offenders. Shore's own interactions with law enforcement during this period, arrests for burglary, auto theft, domestic violence, did not include DNA collection, which was not standard for non-violent offenses at that time. The investigation of individual cases was professionally competent by standards of the period, but the standards themselves precluded identification of serial offender operating across jurisdictional boundaries with evolving but consistent methodology. Forensic investigation in Shore's case exemplifies transformative impact of combined DNA index system, CODIS, implementation and database expansion. In 2003, Shore was convicted of drug-related offenses and required to provide DNA sample pursuant to Texas law mandating collection from felony arrestees. This sample, entered into CODIS, produced cold hit match to DNA from 1992 murder of Maria del Carmen Estrada. The match probability, exceeding 1 in billions, provided definitive identification of Shore as offender in that case and generated intensive review of other unsolved cases with preserved evidence. The CODIS hit was received by Houston Police Department Cold Case Unit, established specifically to apply new DNA capabilities to dormant investigations. Their review identified additional potential linkages based on methodology similarities. Re-examination of DNA evidence from Lori Tremblay, Selma Jansk, Diana Rebelar, and Dana Sanchez cases confirmed identical offender profile, establishing serial series spanning nearly a decade that had remained undetected. The forensic timeline, correlating Shore's known residences and employment with murder locations, provided additional circumstantial confirmation. Recovery of trophies and documentation from Shore's residence during search warrant execution provided physical evidence connecting him to specific victims. The DNA technology that enabled identification, PCR amplification, STR analysis, database searching, represented revolutionary advance from 1986 capability. Evidence preserved through decade by conscientious evidence technicians, sometimes against resource pressures, became probative through technological advance rather than deterioration. This pattern, repeated across American law enforcement in 2000s, demonstrated how cold case investigation could achieve resolution impossible at offense commission and provided powerful argument for evidence preservation and database expansion policies of the investigative breakthrough crystallized through CODIS cold hit and subsequent rapid case construction. Upon notification of DNA match, Houston Police Department Cold Case Unit immediately initiated surveillance of Shore, confirming his residence and activities while preparing search warrant application based on match and case linkage analysis. The search of Shore's apartment on October 24, 2003, produced overwhelming evidence, trophies including ligatures and jewelry from multiple victims, written accounts of offenses, audio recordings, and additional materials documenting decades of violent fantasy. Shore's interrogation, conducted by experienced homicide investigators, initially produced denial but collapsed when confronted with DNA evidence and recovered materials. His subsequent confession, detailed and apparently voluntary, confirmed all 5 murders and suggested additional offenses without sufficient specificity for charge. The arrest, accomplished without incident, represented culmination of decade-long investigation and technological development that had transformed dormant case into solvable crime. The decision to seek death penalty was immediate given offense characteristics and evidence strength. Shore's waiver of jury trial, opting for bench trial before Judge Caprice Cosper, represented defense strategy to avoid jury exposure to graphic evidence while preserving appellate issues for subsequent litigation. The trial's brevity, conviction after minimal evidence presentation, reflected overwhelming proof and Shore's own apparent desire for resolution, though psychological assessments suggested complex motivations including fantasy fulfillment through public exposure. Legal proceedings against Anthony Shore were streamlined by his cooperation and the evidence strength, though significant legal issues emerged. The bench trial before Judge Cosper in October 2004 proceeded through prosecution presentation of DNA evidence, forensic testimony, and Shore's confession. Defense emphasized voluntary intoxication and psychological disturbance as mitigating culpability but presented no substantial challenge to factual guilt. Judge Cosper's guilty verdict, entered after brief deliberation, initiated penalty phase in which prosecution presented victim impact testimony and evidence of offense heinousness. Shore himself requested death sentence, stating he would kill again if given opportunity. The death sentence, imposed November 2004, initiated automatic appellate review. Shore subsequently attempted to withdraw his waiver of jury trial and challenge conviction through various procedural mechanisms, all unsuccessful. His execution, scheduled multiple times and delayed by litigation and procedural challenges, was finally accomplished on January 18, 2018, by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit. The 16 years between conviction and execution, among longest in Texas history, reflected extensive litigation including challenges to lethal injection protocol, competency for execution determinations, and successive habeas corpus petitions. Shore's death, opposed by some victims' family members who preferred life imprisonment and supported by others who sought finality, concluded legal process without resolving questions about his potential additional victims or the systemic failures that enabled his decade-long series. The lasting impact of Anthony Shore case extends through forensic science development, cold case investigation methodology, and victim services evolution. The CODIS cold hit that identified Shore became exemplary case for database expansion advocacy, demonstrating how DNA collection from arrestees and convicted offenders could solve violent crimes without new victimization. Texas legislation mandating expanded DNA collection, influenced by Shore case and similar successes, increased database size and cold hit rate substantially. The Houston Police Department Cold Case Unit, instrumental in Shore identification, became model for similar units nationwide. Their methodology of systematic DNA review, case linkage analysis, and investigative coordination informed best practice development. For victims' families, resolution after extended uncertainty provided partial closure complicated by extended litigation and execution controversy. Several became advocates for victim rights legislation and cold case investigation funding. The specific victims are memorialized through scholarships, community events, and ongoing familial remembrance. Their names appear in forensic science training materials as exemplars of justice delayed but achieved. The case's representation in media, including extensive documentary treatment, has emphasized technological triumph while occasionally minimizing victim individuality. Advocacy efforts have sought to restore balance by centering victim experience. Shore's execution, one of relatively few accomplished for murders committed in 1980s to 1990s given appellate litigation patterns, represented procedural conclusion without psychological resolution for those most affected. The questions he left unanswered, potential additional victims and full scope of his offending, will persist without his cooperation now permanently foreclosed. Number 5. The case of Larry Eyler, the Indiana-based serial killer known as the Highway Killer who murdered at least 19 young men across multiple states in the early 1980s, illustrates the challenges of investigating transient serial offending and the complex negotiations between jurisdictions seeking resolution. Larry William Eyler was born on December 21, 1952, in Terre Haute, Indiana, into a working-class family marked by paternal abandonment and maternal instability. His father left when Larry was 2, and his mother remarried repeatedly, creating chaotic domestic environment with frequent relocations. Eyler's childhood, as reconstructed through later psychological evaluation, showed early behavioral disturbance, cruelty to animals, fire-setting, theft, and persistent bedwetting beyond normal age, all indicators associated with future violent offending in criminological literature. His school performance was poor, marked by bullying, victimization, and social isolation. He dropped out of high school without graduating. His emerging homosexuality, in an era and region of intense stigma, created additional psychological stress that Eyler apparently addressed through escalating violence rather than identity integration. His young adulthood included psychiatric hospitalization, suicide attempts, and multiple arrests for public indecency and disorderly conduct related to sexual activity. These interventions, however, failed to address underlying disturbance or prevent progression to homicide. Eyler's appearance, tall, physically powerful, conventionally unremarkable, facilitated his approach to victims. His employment as house painter and construction worker provided occupational cover for travel and irregular schedules. His psychological profile, as developed through post-arrest evaluation, showed severe sadistic disorder with compulsive need for dominance and control expressed through sexual violence. His victims were specifically selected for physical slightness, youth, and vulnerability that allowed his fantasy enactment without effective resistance. The victims of Larry Eyler were predominantly young men, many teenagers, selected across multiple Midwestern states for availability and vulnerability. The confirmed 19 likely underrepresent total offending. Stephen Agon, 15, was Eyler's first confirmed victim, murdered in 1982 in Terre Haute. His body, discovered in abandoned house, showed evidence of binding, sexual assault, and multiple stab wounds. Jamie Brandenburg, 19, was found in Indiana cornfield in 1983, his body similarly positioned and mutilated. John Bartlett, 19, and Robert Foley, 18, were discovered together in Illinois in 1983, their murders showing progression in Eyler's method, including more elaborate bondage and extended torture. Richard Wayne, 16, was found in Indiana in 1983, his throat slashed after sexual assault. Michael Bauer, 19, and Richard Johnston, 17, were among Illinois victims, their ages typical of Eyler's selection pattern. The Indiana victims particularly included young men known to be gay or questioning, vulnerable to approach in isolated settings where they sought community. Eyler exploited these safe spaces, transforming them into killing grounds. The Illinois victims showed similar pattern, with some additional drug involvement or survival sex work that increased vulnerability. Beyond confirmed identifications, Eyler implied additional victims in Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Ohio without providing sufficient detail for charge. The true scope of his offending likely exceeds formal conviction. Each victim was individual with family, often with unrecognized promise. Egon's mother maintained his room for decades. Brandenburg's sister became victim advocate. Bartlett's family established memorial scholarship. The common factor was encounter with Eyler, whose mobility and method allowed extended series without immediate pattern recognition by investigators limited to single jurisdictions. The Midwestern United States in the early 1980s provided optimal conditions for transient serial offending, extensive interstate highway networks enabling rapid movement across state lines, jurisdictional boundaries that fragmented law enforcement response, limited communication technology preventing immediate information sharing, and cultural conditions that rendered some victim populations, gay youth, runaways, substance users, less likely to generate sustained investigative attention. Eyler's base in Terre Haute, Indiana, positioned him centrally for travel, Illinois to west, Kentucky to south, Ohio to east, all within hours of driving. His employment as house painter justified travel with tools and materials, his vehicle providing mobile crime scene for abduction, assault, and murder. The specific locations of body disposal, rural roads, cornfields, abandoned structures, were selected for concealment and personal significance. Eyler returned to some sites, suggesting fantasy attachment. The gay community in Midwestern cities during this period, emerging from greater secrecy but still heavily stigmatized, provided victim access through bars, cruising areas, and social networks where young men sought connection. Eyler's age and appearance allowed him to present as peer or mentor rather than threat. Law enforcement response to missing young men, particularly those with any history of substance use or sex work, was often delayed and limited. The assumption that such individuals had voluntarily departed reduced early investigative intensity. The cultural context of AIDS panic in early 1980s further complicated response, as some victim deaths were initially misattributed to emerging epidemic rather than homicide. These systemic conditions enabled Eyler's extended offending until technological and procedural developments allowed pattern recognition and identification. The timeline of Eyler's confirmed criminal activity spans 1982 to 1984, with possible earlier and later offending. The 1982 Terre Haute murder of Stephen Egon established Eyler's operational method, approach of young male, transportation to isolated location, binding and sexual torture, murder by stabbing or strangulation, body disposal with minimal concealment. The 1983 acceleration victims in Indiana and Illinois at rate of approximately monthly suggested increasing compulsion or confidence in evasion. Eyler's relationship with Robert Little, an older married man who became his accomplice in several Illinois murders, introduced complex dynamics of dominance and complicity. Little's subsequent prosecution and Eyler's accusations against him would complicate case resolution. The specific events of individual murders followed consistent pattern. Eyler would encounter victim in public location, often gay bar or cruising area, offer transportation or companionship, and implement violence once privacy was secured. The torture elements, binding, beating, sexual assault with objects, prolonged knife play, escalated through offense series, suggesting learning and fantasy refinement. Murder was typically by multiple stab wounds or ligature strangulation. Bodies were positioned in degrading postures suggesting contempt for victims. Eyler's retention of clothing items and personal effects as trophies, discovered after arrest, demonstrated paraphilic attachment to offenses. His near misses, witnesses observing suspicious behavior, victims escaping before fatal culmination, did not result in identification due to victim reluctance to report and law enforcement dismissal of complaints from marginalized individuals. The series might have extended indefinitely but for technological development in forensic identification, the crimes themselves, reconstructed through Eyler's eventual statements and forensic evidence, demonstrated organized sadistic offending with complex psychological motivations. The abduction phase involved deception rather than immediate force, Eyler's physical presence and apparent normalcy overcoming victim caution. Control was established through surprise and overwhelming physical force, binding, often with victim's own clothing or materials Eyler carried, prevented escape and enabled extended torture. The sexual violence was instrumental to Eyler's gratification rather than primarily expressive. He sought victim suffering, fear, and degradation as essential components of his arousal pattern. The murder, when it came after hours of torture, was often anticlimactic, final stab wounds or strangulation eliminating witness rather than providing peak gratification. Post-mortem mutilation in some cases suggested additional violent fantasy or attempt to delay identification. Body disposal was pragmatic rather than elaborate, selection of rural locations providing temporary concealment without expectation of permanent disappearance. Eyler's return to some sites, his collection of news coverage, his retention of victim effects, all demonstrated ongoing fantasy connection to offenses that sustained him between killings. The parallel normalcy of his occupational and social functioning, his continuing relationship with Robert Little, his maintenance of employment, his interactions with family illustrated the compartmentalization that enables extended serial offending. His victims' families meanwhile experienced permanent rupture without understanding, unable to comprehend how their sons had encountered such violence. Discovery and initial investigation of Eyler's crimes proceeded through fragmented jurisdictional responses without pattern recognition. Stephen Agon's 1982 murder generated Terre Haute police investigation without identification. The 1983 Indiana victims similarly produced individual case files without systematic linkage. The Illinois murders, investigated by multiple agencies including Illinois State Police and Cook County Sheriff's Office, showed clearer pattern similarities, method, victimology, geographic clustering that suggested serial offender, but without suspect identification. Robert Little's involvement in several Illinois murders, suspected by investigators, complicated pattern analysis as some elements appeared inconsistent with single offender. The critical development came with Eyler's traffic stop on August 21, 1983, by Kentucky State Police on Interstate 65. Officers observed blood in vehicle, discovered bondage materials and knives, and arrested Eyler for traffic violations and suspicion of kidnapping. The young man with Eyler, identified as victim rather than accomplice, provided testimony of abduction and imminent violence prevented by police intervention. This arrest, however, did not immediately resolve the murder series. Kentucky authorities focused on local charges, Eyler was released on bond, and the connection to Midwestern murders required months of investigative correlation. Eyler's subsequent arrest on December 19, 1983, by Indiana authorities, followed discovery of dismembered remains of Daniel Bridges in garbage bags near Eyler's apartment, provided definitive murder charge and basis for comprehensive investigation. The Bridges case, with Eyler's direct connection and physical evidence, became foundation for prosecution while investigators worked to establish connections to additional victims. Forensic investigation in Eyler case represented early application of emerging DNA and forensic identification technologies to serial murder investigation. The 1983 Kentucky traffic stop produced blood evidence that, while not immediately connected to specific victims, was preserved for future analysis. The bondage materials and weapons provided behavioral evidence of violent sexual intent. The Daniel Bridges dismemberment recovery in December 1983 provided comprehensive forensic opportunity. DNA analysis confirmed Bridges' identity, toolmark analysis linked dismemberment to specific implements in Eyler's possession, blood spatter analysis reconstructed killing location, and fingerprint evidence established Eyler's exclusive contact with disposal materials. Comparison of evidence from Illinois murders, fiber analysis, blood typing, knife wound patterns, with materials from Eyler's residence and vehicle provided circumstantial connections, though definitive DNA linkage awaited technological development. The most significant forensic development was mitochondrial DNA analysis applied to hair evidence from multiple crime scenes, demonstrating consistent donor potentially matching Eyler. This technique, novel at the time, provided associative evidence supporting prosecution theory of serial offending. Eyler's own statements, varying between denial and partial admission, provided additional investigative leads that were verified or refuted through forensic analysis. The comprehensive forensic documentation, preserved through extended pretrial period, enabled subsequent cold case resolution and identification of additional victims even after Eyler's death. The investigative breakthrough crystallized through Eyler's custody on Bridges' murder and subsequent pattern recognition across jurisdictions. Indiana investigators, alerted by Kentucky arrest and subsequent release, maintained surveillance that discovered Bridges' remains. Immediate arrest on murder charges isolated Eyler for interrogation and prevented further offending. The interrogation, conducted by experienced homicide investigators from multiple jurisdictions, produced inconsistent statements and partial admissions that, combined with physical evidence, supported prosecution while revealing Eyler's psychological characteristics. Critical development was information sharing between Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky authorities, facilitated by FBI Behavioral Science Unit consultation that identified pattern consistent with organized serial offending. The decision to charge Eyler initially with Bridges' murder alone, while continuing investigation of additional cases, represented prosecutorial strategy to secure conviction while building broader case. This strategy was complicated by Eyler's subsequent statements implicating Robert Little and suggesting accomplice liability defenses. The arrest and investigation of Little based on Eyler's accusations produced complex litigation. Little was eventually convicted of several Illinois murders based on independent evidence, while Eyler's claims of compulsion or coercion were rejected by investigators and courts. The comprehensive case construction, involving multiple prosecutors' offices and law enforcement agencies, required unprecedented coordination. The resulting charges, 19 murders across 2 states, represented among most extensive serial murder prosecutions in American history. Legal proceedings against Larry Eyler were extraordinarily complex, extending nearly a decade through trial, sentencing, appeals, and eventual execution. The initial Lake County, Indiana, prosecution for Daniel Bridges' murder commenced in 1984. Eyler's defense, led by attorney David Shippers, challenged physical evidence admissibility and suggested Robert Little as actual killer, but jury conviction on February 24, 1986, produced death sentence. The subsequent Illinois prosecution for multiple murders involved extensive negotiation. Eyler offered to plead guilty and provide detailed information on additional victims in exchange for life imprisonment rather than death sentence. This negotiation, conducted with Lake County prosecutor Jack Crawford and approved by victims' families in Indiana, produced comprehensive guilty plea in Illinois on October 4, 1986, with Eyler's detailed statements enabling identification of previously unknown victims and resolution of cases for their families. The Indiana death sentence, however, remained in effect. Eyler's subsequent attempts to withdraw Illinois plea and challenge Indiana's sentence consumed years of litigation. The Illinois plea agreement specifically required Eyler's truthful cooperation. His subsequent accusations against Robert Little and claims of innocence were determined to violate this agreement, though courts rejected state's attempt to vacate plea given its utility in victim identification. Eyler's death sentence was affirmed through Indiana appellate review and federal habeas corpus proceedings. He was executed by lethal injection on March 6, 1990, at Indiana State Prison. The execution occurred despite last-minute litigation and claims of actual innocence. Eyler's final statements maintained that Robert Little had been primarily responsible, claims rejected by investigators and courts. The lasting impact of Larry Eyler case extends through multiple domains: forensic science development, interstate investigation coordination, victim services for families of murdered gay men, and capital punishment policy. The mitochondrial DNA techniques applied in Eyler case advanced forensic capabilities and database development. The multi-jurisdictional coordination, initially improvised, became model for subsequent serial murder investigations and informed FBI Violent Criminal Apprehension Program (VICAP) development. The identification of additional victims through Eyler's cooperation, despite its problematic negotiation context, provided partial resolution for families who might never have known their sons' fates. This benefit, substantial for individual families, created ethical precedent for plea negotiations with capital defendants that remains contested. The case's representation in LGBTQ history documents the particular vulnerability of gay youth in 1980s America and the differential law enforcement response that enabled extended victimization. Subsequent victim services development has specifically addressed these historical inequities. For Terre Haute and other affected communities, the case represented traumatic disruption of identity as safe, conventional Midwestern locations. Memorials to victims have sought to restore individual dignity against the reduction to case numbers. Eyler's execution, one of relatively few accomplished in Indiana before state's capital punishment moratorium, provided procedural conclusion without psychological resolution, the questions about additional victims, about Robert Little's precise role, about the origins of Eyler's violence, persist without his cooperation now permanently foreclosed. For those who have remained with this documentary through to its conclusion, your attention to these complex and disturbing cases is genuinely appreciated. The stories we have examined of medical trust betrayed, of maternal violence, of adolescent predation, of technological justice delayed and achieved, of transient evil crossing jurisdictions, demand sustained engagement rather than superficial consumption. If this form of in-depth, verified true crime documentation serves your interests, I would encourage you to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications for future releases, as each production requires extensive research and careful verification before publication. Your engagement through liking this video helps extend its reach to others who value documentary rigor over sensationalism, while your comments sharing which case most affected you and why provide essential feedback for future production decisions. I am genuinely curious where in the world you are watching from. This channel has reached viewers across 6 continents, and understanding the geographic distribution of our audience helps shape both case selection and presentation approach. Whether you are viewing from a major metropolitan area or a remote location, your presence represents the global interest in understanding how criminal justice systems respond to the darkest human capabilities. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to remembering the victims whose stories we have attempted to honor with accuracy and respect.